the return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Hello, everyone, and it's just me and Joe Phillips, former Director of Comms for Paddy Ashdown, the former leader of the Liberal Democratic Party today, talking about a very fast-moving scene on a number of fronts. We're going to touch on the big European deal, that's the details of which are emerging as we do this podcast, examining to what extent there's backbench discontent on the Labour benches about benefit cuts and things like that, the surprise victory of a pro-European in Romania, and we're going to look at Donald Trump's whistle-stop tour of the Middle East, which, as my colleague Joe has already observed to me off air, did not include Israel. Does this signify a change of policy by the United States? So a lot to get through, Joe. The European deal, as it's emerging, obviously the Eurosceptics are on the march about fish. I mean, fish always assumes a huge importance in these negotiations, but with great respect to our fisher folk, and I'm originally from the southwest, so I'm not being disparaging. It's a tiny part of the British economy, but it gets all caught up in all sorts of symbolisms. But your general overview of this tiptoeing back to some sense in our relations with the European Union.
Well, my general sense is that we should stop tiptoeing and actually go marching in and say, hello, we're back. How can we work together? I think Keir Starmer has been I know it's been difficult because of Trump in the White House, and we've talked about that before. He's had to go on this tightrope between, staying close to America, but also, I think, ideologically and for many other reasons, wanting to be closer to Europe. I mean, if you look at the headlines of all the papers today, Jim, apart from The Guardian and The Eye, I think, and the ones that didn't cover it, it's all about surrender, surrender. He's selling out, the betrayal of Brexit. Well, the referendum was in 2016, nearly 10 years ago. You can bet your life if you had that referendum tomorrow, the outcome would be different. It might be as close as it was in 2016, but the more people recognise that actually our future lies in Europe. And I think that's been brought home partly because of the war in Ukraine, but also the people who voted Brexit were sold a lie, and the failure of successive governments, Tory governments, to negotiate on things like the red tape, which has strangled British fishing. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a bloke he's a fish merchant in the West Country in Devon, and he said since day one of Brexit, their bureaucracy and their paperwork has quadrupled. And they get fish that is sent back from France, for the tiniest little mistake. So actually, it's not as though we are selling out our fisher folk or our farmers or our food producers or other people. It's actually about making business easier and therefore cheaper. And I just think it's time for Keir Starmer to actually have a bit of gumption and stand up to the people and say, OK, yeah, some of you did vote for Brexit. What you voted for was a pack of lies. Now we're trying to sort it out, which will make life easier. And certainly, when you look at the impact on pharmaceuticals, when you look at the impact on what they're calling the phytosanitary stuff, which sounds a bit like bath cleaner, but is in fact about food and other perishable produce, it will be much better for businesses in this country, whether they're cheesemakers or fishermen or farmers, than it is at the moment, because at the moment everybody's strangled by red tape. And of course the other thing is we're coming up to summer holiday time. If this makes it easier for people to get through the endless queues, whether it's at Dover or Gatwick or Manchester or Leeds, and they can use the e-gates, the European gates, then everybody's going to be happy. I think I think Keir Starmer needs to show some gumption on this, actually.
Well, let me just slightly push back on this. I mean, the polls would suggest that actually Keir Starmer is more or less in lockstep with the British people. The polls seem to indicate that the British people do want to be able to go through the passport queues quicker. They do want the fresh food on their shelves and so on, and therefore they're broadly in support of what Starmer's trying to do. But sadly, from my point of view and your point of view, but we've got to rein ourselves in here, Joe. The British people do not seem to want, not only not to go back into the European Union, but do not seem to want to go back into the single market, the customs union and freedom of movement, and which is, of course, causing all the difficulties that Starmer's having in trying to sort of say to the Europeans, we want this, but we've got these red lines. But, if we're being complete democrats, that seems to be where the British people are. Baby steps. You challenged my phrase, baby steps, but that seems to be what the British people want.
Yeah, well, but then the British people, of which we are part, are also they want fabulous public services, but they don't want to pay tax. And there is a time when actually you have to be a bit grown up. And there is one thing in Keir Starmer's favour, that although he's utterly boring and very loyally and has been a disappointment on many fronts, he isn't promising sugar-coated pills. He's always said it was going to be difficult. But I think if people begin to see it, there was a poll in the Sunday Times yesterday, 84% of people who voted in it, obviously it's self-selecting, said that they wanted a reset with Europe. And I think, it's about the language, and we'll come on, I'm sure, in a minute to the language he used about an island of strangers. But, a reset, at least within, it's less than a year since he was elected to government, to have got this far. The fact that the summit is happening in London, the fact that he has rebuilt so many good relationships with Macron, Meloni, and various other European leaders, and there's been an election in Germany, and we've seen an increasingly aggressive Russia, and we've also seen a change in sort of global dynamics because of Trump. I think he's done a miraculous job to get this far, actually.
Yes. Just a little bit more on this deal. The Brexiteers are worried that we're going to be signing up to going along with any changes in European standards, i.e. if we have a food deal and the European Union changes some rules about margarine or whatever it is, that we will have to accept that change, which, in one sense is fairly trivial, but in another goes right to the heart of the argument that we're rule takers, not rule makers. Do you think that element's going to cause problems?
Well, I'm sure there'll be an awful lot of huffing and puffing and shouting from Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage and the Daily Mail and the Express and all the usual suspects. But, you can say you want to be a rule maker, not a rule breaker. But if you want to trade with Europe, they are making the rules under which you have to trade, which has made it almost impossible, to wit, the fish merchant I was mentioning earlier, or people who are exporting other things, but people working in horticulture, the transport or the travel and ease of movement for musicians and performers. So actually, we're having to abide by their rules. Surely it's much better that we actually are all part of the same thing, and we've got those rules. We don't have to join a single market, we don't have to rejoin the EU, and I'm not sure that Europe would welcome us, and there would probably be calls for a referendum and so on and so forth. But we've got to do something, because 10 years on, nothing has improved for anybody, and a lot of things have got an awful lot worse and a lot more expensive.
Now, before we come on to Sir Keir's difficulties with his backbenchers, I think we should, in fairness, mark that the fact that there are, he has done 3 trade deals. Yeah. So, at last, after the government sort of being on the ropes almost from the moment they got elected, there does seem to be a bit of progress with the American, Indian and EU trade deals, plus the unexpected good growth figures that we've had in the last week. Now, some people say that's all going to come crashing down because the April increases in tax are all going to come through, and there's been some sort of stockpiling because of Trump's tariffs, that next month we could have bad figures again. But just at the moment, in terms of the government's fortunes, would you say there's been a slight turning point?
I think on the sort of the broader scale, and certainly the global scale, I would say yes. Apart from the rather embarrassing incident in Albania with the incredibly tall Albanian leader, where, you know, unfortunately, Keir Starmer, and again, it comes back to comms and optics and all that sort of stuff. Why was that ever on the cards that there was going to be a deal with Albania? Surely they knew there wasn't going to be. And, you know, it raised all sorts of questions. Well, why was he there? Well, we know why he was there, but actually, why wasn't David Lammy or Yvette Cooper having those conversations?
Well, David Lammy was sorting out his taxi problems.
Well, yeah,
following
exactly.
that saga.
Guess who I had in the back of the cab last week? Yeah, all of that. But I think, you know, in terms of playing a straight bat, if you like, Keir Starmer has managed to maintain, if not a special relationship, which I've always thought is dubious anyway, but an entente cordiale with Trump against all the odds. He's done really well on Europe. He's been at the forefront with Macron as well, actually, of, you know, support for Ukraine, continued support for Ukraine, beefing up security and defense. And, you know, people can moan as much as they like about Brexit and betrayal of a referendum 10 years ago. Russia hadn't invaded, well, actually it invaded Crimea. But, you know, we hadn't got war on mainland Europe when we went into the referendum. We now have, and Putin's not moving, and nothing is changing other than the threat is much more real. So, you know, defense and security, it clearly lies with Europe. It doesn't lie with America, because America has made that very clear that they are not going to be, you know, they're not going to shield us from everything. So I think, yes, in broad terms, I think Keir Starmer has done very well, but I think it's always the problem, Jim, as you and I know, having been veterans of these sort of ups and downs. When leaders do well on the international stage, they are often accused of ignoring what's going on at home. But I think the sliver of light in that is the growth in GDP. I mean, it's tiny, it's, you know, 0.7%, but it is going in the right direction. It's the direction of travel that's important. It was unexpected, and it puts us way up there in the G7 group of.
But what do you think about what I said about it could be just a 1 month thing, and then the shock of the April changes will bring it down again?
Yeah, I mean, it may well be, and I think, you know, you can look around you and you can see in high streets across the country that shops are closing, and the reason that they're closing is because they can't afford higher council tax or business rates. They can't afford the increased national insurance. Employers.
Yeah, Poundland's in trouble apparently.
Who is?
Poundland's in trouble apparently.
Yeah. And you know, you look around anywhere, and it's the little shops that are the sort of the heartbeat of a community, like the hairdressers and the newsagents and the bakers and the butchers, and the little cafes, and they're closing. Now that's what people see. What they don't see is what's going on at a European summit. They'll take a view, obviously, depending on which paper they read or which outlet they listen to. But, you know, what you see on your doorstep and on your high street is decline and doom and gloom. So there's still a long way to go. And I think, you know, it may well be that if we have a spell of reasonable weather, we've had the VE Day celebrations, which saw probably an uptick in pub takings and things like that. If we have a spell of good weather for the next couple of months, then things might not be so bad in the next quarter.
Well, I know a little bit about the weather, and it's about to break this week. And I really hope I'm wrong about this, but I've known summers like this before, where we have all our summer in May, and then it never recovers, and it's generally a sort of rather wet and disappointing rest of the summer. But do not listen to me shroud waving about the weather. Let's turn to the other side of Sir Keir's portfolio at the moment, which isn't looking so good. One is the offence that many people took about his Island of Strangers speech. Now, you referred to our veteran qualities, Joe, so I imagine I know where I was in April 1968. I was with a young Conservative friend of mine on the day that Enoch Powell made his speech. And I mean, there was a lot of stuff in it, really offensive stuff that they haven't picked up on. And of course, Ted Heath, who was the leader of the party at the time, immediately sacked him as the Shadow Health Secretary. But of course, you know, The Dockers marched in support of Powell, and he was a very divisive figure. But this island of strangers, this word strangers was in the Powell speech and was in Sir Keir's speech. I mean, the basic question is, do you think it was deliberate?
I think it was stupid. I think it was done by people who are, you write a speech by committee, and who's there old enough or wise enough or brave enough to say, hang on a minute, that sounds a little bit like Enoch Powell. It might not have meant to be. And many of the people who will say, oh, that sounds like Enoch Powell, probably don't even know who Enoch Powell was, and certainly don't remember the speech and his rather strange way of speaking. But I just think it was thoughtless. An island of strangers, what does that mean? By its very nature, we live on an island. There is, who's come here? People from other places. And that sense of strangers being bad does not sit alongside, we welcome you. I mean, it just is such a, for whatever he wanted us to concentrate on, everybody's focused on that. And it was really bad. It was really sloppy. And somebody grown up should have said, take that sentence out.
You see, I slightly read it differently, because I did a lot of coverage around 2000 about the disparate communities in Oldham. There was a major report after the Oldham riots identifying that Oldham had turned into almost a segregated town.
I know, I was working for John Denham then. Right.
Well, that communities had nothing in common.
Yeah.
And I took it that if we go on with this uncontrolled immigration, that those tendencies and that the number of people available to be in these completely separate communities would grow. And that's what he meant by an island of strangers. But, the fact that there's this ambiguity, you're probably right that best left out of the speech if it's going to cause this monumental row.
Well, and I just think, we know people are concerned about immigration, and there are two types. There's the huge, massive increase in legal immigration since Brexit, because we lost all of the European friends and neighbours who were coming here and going back and, doing amazing jobs as plumbers or doctors or whatever, and they were going home again. And we've now seen this huge increase in people to fill the gaps that we know exist in social care and everything else. Now, the government has come up with some measures, but you've got the universities whinging on the one hand saying, oh, we can't afford to keep going if we don't have foreign students because they subsidise UK students. Well, maybe you need to look at the number of universities and the courses they're offering and how long they run for and the amount of money you pay vice chancellors. But the other thing, of course, is the illegal immigration, which is so very evident and so very, photogenic is the wrong word, but it is such an instant picture of people coming ashore, boatloads, literally, compared with a couple of blokes in the back of a lorry, which is how it was a few years ago. Now, that there is no doubt that the boat crossings concern people, whether or not they are living here on the Kent coast or whether they're actually somewhere else where migrants are sent to. But, the conversation it shouldn't be about demonizing the human beings who are coming here for whatever reason. It should be about demonizing a system which makes it impossible for people to use legal routes, and reminding people that since we left the European Union, we don't have access to the fingerprint database that would immediately say, okay, Mr. Hancock, we've got your fingerprints and we see that you've already been prosecuted for a crime in your hometown in Albania. So off you go. You're not even getting here. So we've lost all of that access. And I don't think anybody should underestimate the lack of goodwill, the loss of goodwill, if you like, that went out of the window as soon as we left Europe. And then you had, a parade of Boris Johnson and Priti Patel and Suella Braverman and all the rest of them, just basically saying, oh, it's the French's fault. Well, it's not, actually. It's the fault of the gangs who smuggle people here, but it's also why are people so desperate?
Let's move on to the question of benefits. It seems incredible, given the government's huge majority, that it's even contemplated that they could be actually defeated in the Commons by their backbenchers. But such is the level of concern about various aspects benefit cuts that the Chancellor wants to make, that I'm going to be very interested in your assessment of this, Joe. I mean, it's multifaceted. There is, of course, the winter fuel allowance, a lot of speculation. There'll be some clawing back of that to try and appease the backbenchers, but it's also other benefits as well. Speculation that perhaps the 2-child benefit cap will be raised. There is clearly a level of anger amongst backbenchers, and I suppose it's partly fueled by the fact that a lot of them are new, came in probably fairly idealistically thinking, this is going to be a great Labour crusade and we're going to work with ministers and complete the sort of Starmer revolution and put our impact on the country, and it'll all be good. We'll have a honeymoon for a couple of years, when in fact they've sort of been plunged into what you and I recognise as a fairly familiar pattern of tension between the Labour backbenchers and the government.
Yeah, and I think, for many new MPs, it will be quite a shock. The announcement on the winter fuel came within weeks of them taking office, completely unexpected, completely out of the blue, and that's what they will be remembered for, certainly until something else happens. So yeah, I think there are probably quite a few MPs looking over their shoulders, having seen very disappointing results in the May local elections. And they'll be looking at, either Reform snapping at their heels or the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, because, we talk a lot about Reform being the main challenger to Labour and the Tories. But in actual fact, the Greens and the Liberal Democrats are scooping up support amongst what used to be Middle England, the old-fashioned Conservative with a small c party. And if Starmer thinks by... and there are many people within the Labour Party or who voted Labour who are also very uncomfortable about this move to the right, whether it's about the tone of voice, as we were just talking about the island of strangers, whether it's about, coming down hard on immigration, because there are an awful lot of us that might think, well, actually, hang on a minute, you knew it was a problem, you knew it was an issue, why didn't you make that a centrepiece of your election campaign? It does seem as though they're always one step behind either public sentiment or the threat, whether it's from Reform or whoever else it might be. I mean, they're lucky in a way that the Conservatives are not a force that they're having to worry about at the moment. But I do think there will be many MPs who may actually think, one term will be enough. Now, it's quite possible we may have another by-election at some point in the not too distant future, depending on whether or not there are charges or followed or prosecution of the Tory MP who has been arrested after an incident at the Groucho Club in central London.
Yes, and we also have the Dan Norris situation. If he has to go, that's Jacob Rees-Mogg's old seat.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
But the speculation there is under what colours would Jacob Rees-Mogg fight?
Well, I don't suppose he minds as long as it's in a full bolt of English tweed. But yeah, I mean, it's not easy, and it's not easy being.
So, do you think there will be one's instinct is that there'll be some tweaks on winter fuel or two-child benefit, which will be enough to appease enough Labour backbenchers that it will remotely be a defeat for the government. I mean, that's not possible.
Well, they're not going to get defeated, but I think that if you were going to do anything on winter fuel, you should have done it before the winter. Not waited almost a year before you go, okay, we hear you. Oh, yeah, right, we've lost millions of councillors and everybody's really pissed off, so we'll change it. I mean, that is just pathetic. What you actually need to see is a change, I think, in Rachel Reeves' approach. And, okay, it's only a glimmer of light, and as you said earlier, it might not last for the next quarter. But think about where you're going to be spending money. Also, where is Angela Rayner? Hello? The one woman who engages and connects with people, she sits there silently at PMQs. And yet, actually, she and Shabana Mahmood are doing quite amazing things. And they're plodding on with planning reform and housing and changes to prisons and sentencing, which are actually going to have a huge impact. But somewhere along the line, there is nobody who seems to be central within Keir Starmer's inner circle. David Lammy seems to be slightly sidelined. It's Keir Starmer all over the world. Yvette Cooper, as we know from all Home Secretaries of every political colour, is just burdened by absolutely everything and the intractable movement of people and the civil service. There was a really interesting article that Frank shared with us actually last week about the chance now with senior appointments within the civil service that could have a huge impact on how government works. And I think that was a really, really, maybe we can put a link to it at the end of the podcast, but that's a really important thing. That, you know, government isn't just about the politics or the politicians, it's about the machinery behind it. We've got David Gauke, former Tory prisons minister, his report coming out this week on prison reform. Now, you know, those sort of things make a huge difference. But I think MPs going home at the weekends to their constituencies and next week for the Whitsun week will be hearing the same thing from people. You know, we're hard up, everything's going up, we don't feel any more secure or safe or comfortable. You know, what are you going to do? So it's tough.
Sure. Wearing my Rachel Reeves hat, I would say that she would look forward to hearing from the Conservative Party and the Liberals and the Greens and Reform UK as to where they would get the money from, because she's not doing all this benefit cuts for fun. She's trying to fill a £22 billion black hole.
Yes, and at the same time, just very quietly this week, the COVID recovery unit has been scrapped. So all those people who ripped off the British taxpayer are walking away with their pockets full and nothing will happen to them. So, you know, yes, she is trying to fill a black hole, and we know that. And we know that many of the problems stem, you know, 14 years of underinvestment and lack of oversight and all of those things. But somehow or other, you need to do things where people can see it. And this is their problem. All the things that they need to do are big and long term. If they don't get the long term, they're not going to make any changes.
For our older podcasters, I'd just like to recommend a play that's actually on at Islington in London, which I went to see last Thursday. You're nearer to Islington than I am, and if you can get tickets, Joe, I think you'd enjoy it. It's called The Gang of Three.
Oh, yeah.
It's about the relationship, quite close relationship, allegedly, between Anthony Crossland, Roy Jenkins, and also in the play is Dennis Healey. And these were three titans of the Labour government. And for aficionados of that period, it's certainly worth seeing. But the only reason I mention it is that, of course, that was a time of great stress between the backbenches and the Labour governments of Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan.
Yeah, but it was also a time, actually across the political spectrum, Jim, of people of quite noticeable intellect. And whilst we have many able and good people in Parliament and in councils and in politics and in public life, we don't have the people who've got that intellectual heft. You know, whether it was Anthony Crossland or whether it was Nicholas Ridley, whether it's Michael Heseltine or whether it's David Owen, we haven't got those big brains. What we've got are people who are, you know, they're okay. And some of them are very talented and some of them are very good and some of them will be very good public servants. But we haven't got that weight, that gravitas that allows you to say, okay, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to borrow some money and we're going to build council houses. Not we're going to sort everything out carefully and squeeze tiny little businesses and push them out of business and then be in hock to developers who will say, oh, sorry, I can't afford to do affordable housing.
Yes, well, that's the great unknowns. How many people are there in private life who would have come into a political life and maybe be those giants, but they won't touch it with a barge pole because of social media and all the other stuff that now goes with modern politics. But we haven't got time to discuss that.
No, but it is interesting, Jim, to notice that there have been more than a handful of Reform councillors who've already resigned because they didn't expect to win, one of whom can't serve as a councillor because he works for the local council.
Right, in our remaining minutes, let us turn to foreign affairs. And Frank has always taken a close interest in Romania, and if he was here, I'm not recovering from Everton's last match at Goodison Park yesterday. I'm sure there's business reasons why he's not on today, but it was an absolutely wonderful, emotional event at Goodison yesterday. Nearly had me in tears. He obviously has taken interest in Romania, where in the first round of voting, pro-Russian anti-EU guy was going to win, and then actually apparently last night when the results were announced, made a speech accepting his victory, only having to retrench it later on because a centrist, liberal, pro-EU, prepared to shoulder Romania's responsibilities with its neighbour Ukraine, has been elected.
Yes, I know, and that was quite a turn up for the books, actually, and quite reassuring. We've also got elections going on in Poland this week, which may or may not turn out to be interesting. I think it's not such a tight race, but I think the Romanian George Simenon, who, not to be confused with the person who wrote the Magro books, came from nowhere, catapulted in with the backing of Putin, and was widely expected to walk it. And so, oh no, I've won. Oh no, you haven't. So that's good news, I think.
And finally, turning to Israel, which seems to have slightly succumbed to the international pressure and is now agreeing to some food going in. I must say I'm irritated by both sides in this food thing. I mean, I think the United Nations, UNRWA, was being very precious about how it should be distributed and so on, and refusing to cooperate. But now apparently Israel is going to allow UNRWA to distribute some food before it tries to get its own food distribution going. Israel's case is that the food is Hamas are lying, and there is plenty of food there, and we get very selective pictures.
Well,
or that they loot. Yeah, and I'm just putting this case because I don't think it's often heard enough, to be honest, Joe, and that also that Hamas plunder the food for their own use. And by the way, something else which I don't think is given enough coverage, because I've said on this podcast before, why don't the people of Gaza rise up against these dreadful Hamas people who speak in their name? And I've had a bit of an answer for that, though it's not had the coverage I think it should have done. That anybody who sticks their head above the parapet and criticises Hamas is liable to be executed. So we need to get perspective on this as we look at these awful pictures of these children dying from malnutrition. So I'm trying to give a broad picture of the situation, but do you see it as a significant change?
No, I think Netanyahu only wants to continue this war because it's the only thing that's keeping him in office. And if he's out of office, he will be sent to prison on corruption charges. This is a war that is no longer against Hamas. It's entirely for the support of Netanyahu. And I think it's very difficult for the people of Gaza, the people of Palestine, to stand up against Hamas. Although you do see, some sort of rumblings of that. How can you stand up for democracy when you haven't got the strength to stand up because you're starving? How can you stand up and demand a change of government when you haven't got a roof over your head and you're watching your children starve to death? And I am absolutely, utterly horrified at the way the world, including the UK, has not come down harder on Israel. We just wrap them over the wrists every now and again, and we see children, women, hospital patients being bombed, battered, bruised and starved, and we know perfectly well what they're doing. It is an absolute outrage, and we should all be ashamed. And that doesn't in any way excuse what Hamas did or what Hamas have done. But actually, what we need now is, and you're absolutely right, we need to rebuild Palestine and Gaza with a democratic government or a democratic mandate, and the Arab states have said that they are willing to support that. You can't do that when Israel's bombing 7 bells of shit out of you every day.
And what do you make of the fact that Donald Trump not only didn't visit Israel, but also had quite a friendly meeting with the leader of Syria? That can't have pleased Netanyahu.
I should think Netanyahu was horrified. It was only a couple of weeks ago. He was sitting there in the Oval Office looking like a cat that had got the cream. I think it's significant. I mean, you can't read anything too much into Donald Trump because he's likely to have changed his mind, since we started this podcast. But the fact that he met Syria's interim president and said he's a great guy, he's a very attractive guy, he's a fighter. This is a man who America put a $10 million bounty on his head only a couple of years ago because they wanted him, brought in for terrorism charges. But the fact that Trump ignored Israel, didn't go there, and has spent a lot of, obviously he's only interested in what lines his pocket, feathers his nest. He likes being with rich people. He likes the bling. And, you don't get much more bling than Saudi Arabia. So he's done all of that sort of around the Emirates and meeting up with various
But
other
what intrigues me, and there's a bit of a connection here, Putin and Netanyahu do not seem to be doing what Donald Trump wants.
No.
And I'm fascinated at what point Trump's ego, which is extremely large, comes to bear down on Putin and Netanyahu.
Well, or does he just walk away, which in a way is what he's done, which is, it's like one ghastly big cocktail party at Mar-a-Lago, isn't it? He's bored with Gaza because it hasn't ended and they haven't done what he wanted. So he's walked away. He's gone straight past Benjamin Netanyahu and walked over to Mohammed bin Salman. So you sort of think, okay, so he's bored with them. He'll get bored with Russia soon. I think
the only problem with that, Joe, is that even I absolutely understand, that the United States and the American people to some extent want to withdraw from the world.
Yeah.
But the lessons of history are that you let fires burn and ultimately you get singed yourself.
Well, exactly. And I think one of the, not very widely reported, but one of the significant events of the weekend, and we go back to the Vatican, how interesting, that Pope Leo, the new Pope, did his first Mass, his inaugural Mass. And in attendance were J.D. Vance, who is a Catholic convert, as we know, and also President Zelensky. And Zelensky and Vance actually had quite a lengthy one-to-one chat, it is reported. Now, the Vatican was where there was that fantastic photograph of Trump and Zelensky with flunkies hurrying around to get two chairs so that they could sit together. And you just sort of think, okay, maybe it isn't where you think it's going to happen. Maybe the balance of power comes from other places. But I do think Trump is, he's not done the great deals. He wants to be a deal maker. He wants to be a peacemaker. But above all, he wants to be a deal maker. Well, nobody's taking any notice of his deals with Ukraine as far as Russia's concerned or as far as Israel's concerned. But if he gets closer to the Arab states, where there's an awful lot of money and they know how to play him, you're just here, have a jumbo jet, it's yours, keep it. Then I think that's the sort of thing where that might see a change in the fortunes of the poor people of Gaza and Palestine.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. We're going to take a week's break now for the Whitsun recess, and Frank will be back in this chair, I'm sure, in 2 weeks' time, and we will look forward to that. But in the meantime, have a good break, Joe.